Good morning, APUSHers. Purpose of this video is to conclude our look at topic 7.12, World War II mobilization. This is going to look at the social impact, both with the changes in the economy and the changes that are happening with the war effort. Well, this is going to have an impact on different groups of Americans in different ways, some for the better, some definitely on the more controversial side of this. So let's take a look. Like we talked about in the first part of 712, wartime mobilization led to economic opportunities that's going to lead a lot of Americans to be able to improve their socioeconomic position throughout the war. People that were struggling to get work before are going to have ample job opportunities, strong paying job opportunities through the 4 years that the United States is in this. For women in the workforce, we've talked about this in a couple of different areas. The home front video talked about this. This is the idea of women taking jobs in military production, industrial assembly jobs going on. And this is the sort of like where I guess the icon of Rosie the Riveter comes in. The poster here on the top right, I think it's kind of important to point out, this is not a federal government poster. This is a Westinghouse Electric poster. This is like an industrial company that's producing this to try to encourage their new workforce, the women in their workforce, that yes, they can contribute and they are strong enough to really have a meaningful impact on the war effort. And in the lower picture on this, those three ladies are riveting the interior of a B-25 fuselage, assembling war materials that are going to help protect democracy and freedom all around the world. Women are going to take these jobs because they need people in these jobs. As more and more women enter the workforce in a meaningful, tangible contribution towards the war effort, it's going to create issues when women after the war are asked to return home and return to the domicile. And there's a direct connection that you can make here from Rosie the Riveter and the women's rights movement as it's going to grow in the 1960s. So stay tuned for this once we get to Unit 8. For African Americans, it's kind of a similar track. At the beginning of the war, before Pearl Harbor, a gentleman named A. Philip Randolph, he is a union leader for the Pullman Sleeping Car Porters Union. That is an African American union because sleeping car porters, Pullman porters, they were basically like servants that were employed on these luxury railroad cars. Well, Randolph in 1941 is organizing a march on Washington to protest some of the unfair treatment that African American workers are getting in terms of hours and salaries compared to white workers in the same industry as the war effort is beginning to ramp up. This is attention getting enough and has enough logic to the argument in the context of the war that President Roosevelt issues an executive order. It's 8802. Executive Order 8802 basically, sets a policy that if any company is going to do business with the federal government, it can have no discriminatory practices against anybody on the basis of their race. And so this is kind of a civil rights issued executive order, but the purpose of it isn't really just for civil rights. It is for civil rights specifically in the context of the war effort. But again, there's going to be a ripple effect from this once we get past World War II, and that is important to keep track of. In terms of fighting the war, we talked about the Tuskegee Airmen in a separate section of these online lectures, but African Americans on the home front referred to the war effort as a double V, victory at home and victory abroad. And they are very, I think logical is the right way to say this, to point out that if you're fighting against Nazi racism and Nazi oppression and the revelations of the Holocaust that come in and show the intensity of Nazi racism and oppression. Well, how can the United States go and fight against that, but still have segregation and racial violence that's kind of institutionalized on the home front? And so during the war effort, there is attention being paid to some of the inequalities in the United States. And during the war, it is really set up in such a way that it's just seen in that context. But afterwards, this is going to lead to debates over racial segregation. And I do not think it is a coincidence that the movement towards desegregation is going to start in the years immediately following World War II. World War II is having social impacts that are going to lead to positive changes in the coming years. But World War II is also going to lead to a wider variety of impacts. It's not all positive. In terms of migration from Latin America, this is predominantly Mexican immigration during the war. With the demand for jobs during the war, there is an effort being made to recruit Mexican migrants to come, and it's called the Bracero program. There's really kind of this checkered history of the United States and Mexican immigrant labor during World War I in the 1920s, when the economy was strong. Mexican immigrants were recruited to come into the country and work along the southern border. During the Great Depression, Mexican immigrants were forced out of the country because there was a shortage of jobs. But here in the 1940s, when there's another demand for jobs to help win the war effort, the Bracero program is going to recruit Mexican immigrants to come into the United States, predominantly along in the American Southwest, but also into some northern cities like Chicago. And so this is where there's a little bit more diversity coming into the American population. But these are immigrant workers. They're not American citizens, and they are making money. And as they are earning money, they are, because of their perspective they've got on the war, they're not visibly as dedicated towards the war efforts. So in 1943 in Los Angeles, when American servicemen come into conflict with some Mexican immigrant workers that have made money and are a little bit flashier with this leads to an outbreak of violence that's really just kind of referred to as the Zoot Suit riot. Zoot suits are these kind of big, baggy, oversized suits that the two guys are wearing in this picture. And you can kind of see the serviceman in there in between, where he's just kind of trying to check things out. It's a good contrast of this. But when you know workers are earning money and spending money on themselves because their lives are difficult with the amount of work that they're doing, well, this kind of runs the wrong way against some American servicemen and other Americans that want to see pure dedication to the work effort. And so this leads to a couple of weeks worth of violence that kind of goes across the city of Los Angeles. This is one of the costlier riots in terms of dollars that's going to go on like ever in American history. And it's kind of a sign that there are racial tensions with other racial groups. It's not just a black and white issue of race in the United States anymore. There's other elements to this racial diversity that's coming into being. During World War II, this is probably most visibly felt when you examine the existence of Japanese American internment camps. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor, there was a fear among Americans in California and among policymakers in Washington that Japanese Americans, not Japanese immigrants, but the children of Japanese immigrants, these are American citizens, that they might actually bear loyalty to Japan instead of to the United States. This led to Executive Order 9066, and I know we've got a couple of numbers with these executive orders. But 9066 is the creation of internment camps for Japanese American citizens to keep them in camps and to keep them sequestered or to keep them imprisoned, really for the remainder of the war is the original intent of this. It's important to say that even though this is going to, inter or imprison over 100,000 Japanese Americans and American citizens, there's never any real evidence that shown that any of them were actively working for Japan against the U.S. government in any way whatsoever. And so this is kind of a knee-jerk reaction in many, many ways. Towards the conclusion of the war, look, by 1943, we talked about how Japanese American men are enlisting and being sent to go fight. When they are sent to go fight overseas, they are sent to the European theater of war because there's still just a little bit of that lingering doubt and hesitancy. In 1944, this is actually taken to the Supreme Court, and the case is Korematsu v. United States. And in the Supreme Court rules that this is actually a justifiable action by the United States in the name of national defense. So you get to this issue where it's a debate between rights versus security. And in this case, in later decades, it's kind of a general agreement that this was a violation of rights. But in the context of the war itself, the Supreme Court ruled that it was not a violation of rights. Later on in the 1980s, the federal government tries to, they make amends in some ways. They issue a formal apology for this entire series of actions taken against American citizens, and they actually kind of offer reparations, $20,000 for each person still alive in 1988 that was interred in one of these camps. It's not a ton of money, but it does kind of go a long way when the United States government issues an apology and recognizes the wrong of the past. It doesn't happen all that often. So with the Zoot Suit riots and with the internment camps, there are social questions that come out of this, but also constitutional questions. Who do the rights in the country actually apply to? Is there a violation of rights when you're talking about racial segregation? If this is really a fight for democracy, how do you justify a fight for democracy overseas when there are questions about the equality within the American democracy on the home front? And I think this is one of the themes I'm trying to establish through several of these videos here on World War II. It's not just about World War II. During the 1940s, that's where all of the focus was, but every decision that gets made on the home front during the war is going to have a ripple effect on things when you get past the war into the 1950s and 60s. And that is going to be a central part of what we talk about in Unit 8 as we get closer and closer to modern day. Thanks for listening.